Penguin Random House Audio presents The Confidence Men, How Two Prisoners of War Engineered the Most Remarkable Escape in History, by Margalit Fox. Read for you by Richard Elfyn. Somehow, what we would not believe in reality, we will believe in a work of art. Norman N. Holland, The Willing Suspension of Disbelief, Revisited, 1967. Author's Note. In 1928, by an act of the Turkish Parliament, the Turkish language began to be written in a version of the Roman alphabet. The change was part of efforts to modernize the country. Before that date, Turkish had been written in a modified Arabic script. As a result, when pre-1928 Western writers rendered Turkish words in print, their attempts at romanization produced a welter of competing forms. A single example will suffice. The name Yozgad, which denotes both the prisoner of war camp at the heart of this story and the Anatolian town in which it lay, appears variously as Yozgad, Yozgat, Yozgahat, with an H, and Yuzgat. Although many pre-1928 romanizations are anachronistic today, in the interest of reflecting the era in which our story is set, I've generally retained the spellings most commonly used by British writers of the period. I also refer to the region's towns and cities by the names they bore in the West at the time: Angora for Ankara, Constantinople for Istanbul, and the like. Constantinople was for centuries the capital of the Ottoman Empire. In 1923, with the formation of the Republic of Turkey, the city's name was formally changed to Istanbul, and the capital moved to Ankara. In addition, many English-language memoirists of the Ottoman theatre, our heroes E.H. Jones and C.W. Hill included, used the generic term Turks to refer collectively to their Ottoman opponents, be they Turkish, Arab, Jewish, Kurdish, or otherwise, conflating a diverse range of ethnic identities under a single imperial rubric. For linguistic economy, and in keeping with the diction of the early 20th century Britons on whom this book centers, I have occasionally employed Turks and Turkish in generic references throughout the text, although such terms would be considered ethnographically insufficient in modern scholarly discourse. It is also vital to note that Western accounts of the campaigns in Ottoman lands can be fraught with a type of rhetoric: imperialist, exceptionalist, essentialist, orientalist, that is unacceptable today. Such rhetoric, born of what one modern historian calls romanticized misrepresentations of places like the Ottoman Empire as sites of mystery and despotism, and which bolstered ideas of the backwardness of their societies and the superiority of the Western European world, appears at times in this book in quoted matter. The currency conversions in the footnotes, which translate early 20th century pound sterling values into contemporary pound sterling and contemporary US dollars, reflect the historical inflation rate and contemporary exchange rate of late 2020, when this book went to press. Introduction. This is the true story of the most singular prison break ever recorded. A clandestine wartime operation that involved no tunneling, no weapons, and no violence of any kind. Conceived during World War I, it relied on a scheme so outrageous it should never have worked. 2 British officers escaped from an isolated Turkish prison camp by means of a Ouija board. Yet, that scheme, an ingeniously planned, daringly executed confidence game, was precisely the method by which the young captives, Elias Henry Jones and Cedric Waters Hill, sprang themselves from Yozgad, a prisoner of war camp deep in the mountains of Anatolia. The plan seemed born of a fever dream, Using a handmade Ouija board, Jones and Hill would regale their captors with a tale seemingly channeled from the beyond, destined to make them delirious enough to lead the pair out of Yozgad. The ruse would also require our heroes to feign mental illness, stage a double suicide attempt that came perilously close to turning real, and endure 6 months in a Turkish insane asylum, an ordeal that drove them to the edge of actual madness. And yet, in the end, they won their freedom. I first encountered this story several years ago, through Jones's 1919 memoir, The Road to Endor. Long after I finished it, 2 things haunted me. The first was that this astounding tale, rife with cunning, danger, and moments of high farce that rival anything in Catch-22, had slipped into a crevice in history, where it languished unknown to most of the 21st century public. The second was that it had at its centre an enduring mystery. How in the world was this preposterous plan actually able to succeed? Jones's book dwelled minutely on how his ruse worked, detailing a web of plotting, rehearsal, and performance, but there remained the question of why. The precise ingredients of the psychological cocktail that transformed his captors into clay in the potter's hands. Hill's posthumous memoir, The Spook and the Commandant, likewise favours exposition over explanation. The passage of a century has made it possible to solve the mystery at the story's heart. Besides chronicling one of the most ingenious hoaxes ever perpetrated, and one of the only known examples of a con game being used for good instead of ill, The Confidence Men explores the strategy that underpins all confidence schemes. The subtle process of mind control called coercive persuasion, colloquially known as brainwashing. The answers to this book's central questions: how does a master manipulator create and sustain faith? Why do his converts persist in believing things that are patently false? Also, illuminate the behavior of present-day figures such as advertisers, cult leaders, and political demagogues. Above all, The Confidence Men is the story of the profound friendship of 2 men who almost certainly would not have met otherwise. Jones, the Oxford-educated son of a British lord, and Hill, a mechanic on an Australian sheep station, vowing to see the scheme through if it cost them their lives. Each was sustained throughout its myriad hardships by the steadfastness of the other. For a brief period, Jones would write, recalling their 6-month confinement in the madhouse, Hill was put in the bed next mine. It seems a little thing that we should lie there 3 feet apart instead of 10. But it meant much. We did not attempt to talk. We were too closely watched for that. But at night, under cover of darkness, sometimes he and sometimes I would stretch out an arm, and for a brief moment grip the other's hand. The firm, strong pressure of my comrade's fingers used to put everything right. Prologue. A wraith at the top of the stairs. The men huddled in the passageway in the flickering candlelight. Some were wrapped in blankets against the Anatolian winter. Others wore pyjamas. Still others were dressed in British military uniforms, very nearly the only clothing they had. The passage, in which they gathered each night at the top of a dark staircase in a draughty old house, was their de facto sitting room. The house had once been a private home, but the family who lived there had been murdered more than a year before. Since the summer of 1916, when the men were remanded here, this house, with its woeful food, furniture, space, and sanitation, had been their only home. Merely to reach it, they had withstood battle, capture, and, for many, a 2-month forced march through desert and over mountains, on which scores of men would die. Every evening after their sentries locked them in, the men had watched keenly as 2 fellow officers faced each other across a table, built, Like most of the furniture
Sample complete. Ready to continue?